Good afternoon. What I'm going to speak on is whether or not it's possible to end poverty. Now, in many ways, we've been talking about this question. I know some of you in the audience are nodding. We've heard this question being asked a lot. And this is a goal that we have not yet reached. But there have been some very exciting developments in terms of global poverty rates I'm going to talk you through, as well as research on what's caused some of these really favorable trends and why it is that all the countries in the world, the United Nations, have signed up to a goal, the SDG, Sustainable Development Goal, to end poverty by 2030. That's only 13 years from now. Now, I'm going to talk you through economic research, and I will do my best to avoid what can sometimes happen when you talk economics. Economics has been defined as the science of telling you things you've known your whole life, but in a language that you can't understand. So, wish me luck. The very first thing to say is the reason why this goal has become the first SDG, the biggest goal amongst countries, is that over 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty since 1990. So in 1990, more than a third of people in the world lived in what's defined as extreme poverty. So this is living on less than $1.25 per day. It's now been up to $1.90, but it's a similar concept, adjusted for purchasing power parity, what $1 can buy in that country. So the progress has been incredible. We are now at a time when just 1 in 10 around the world live in poverty. Now, of course, the first thing to say is lifting people so they make more than $1.90 a day above that level is not the same thing as saying the world would be prosperous. It's still a very low level. But the fact that it has taken so long and yet to have just seen progress in lifting 1 billion people above that level is an accomplishment, because that means these people are now on track to head into the new global middle class. And that's the other reason why this goal has been adopted and why there's such optimism that it can be achieved. So by the estimates of who is middle class, within about 3 years, more than half of the world's, well, nearly half of the world's population will be considered middle class, and most of them are coming from developing countries. And in fact, the World Bank is so confident that we will see this kind of progress and this big increase in the middle class. They have actually abolished the term developing countries in the way that they discuss their data and analysis. It's only going to be based on regions in the future. Now, one problem I immediately see is what are we going to do about the economics of developing countries paper here at Oxford? This is a big change. And then by about 2030, what you will find is most of the projections say we are headed towards a world in which more than half, nearly 5 billion people, will be middle class. And that will be quite an achievement if we can get there. So now is this is the big question. How has it happened, and can we get there? So right now, there are still 767 million people who live in abject poverty, and that's about 1/10 of the world's population. Half of them live in sub-Saharan Africa, about 1/3 live in South Asia, and the rest are in East Asia, South America, and a smaller proportion are in Latin America and Eastern Europe. Most of the poverty reduction that has happened since 1990 has come from China and East Asia. That country and that region is pretty much on the cusp of ending extreme poverty. They are pretty much where Europe is currently at. But, and here's the big but, that growth story does not extend to the remaining poor. What do I mean by that? Africa has actually seen the absolute number of people living in extreme poverty increase during this period, even though Africa has been the second fastest growing region in the world after only Asia in the past 2 decades or so. So what that's saying is that growth alone is not enough to end poverty. And that has been most of the lesson from China. So I've done quite a lot of research on China. And China has grown with high levels of inequality and not a great deal of focus in terms of poverty reduction. And yet in their case, the growth that they had was enough to lift literally hundreds of millions of people into the middle class, out of being extremely poor. But, and we say this all the time when it comes to economic models, what applies in one part of the world does not necessarily apply in another part of the world. And I think poverty is a very good illustration of that. So fast growth in Africa, high levels of inequality has meant that yes, Africa has been growing, the economies have been expanding, but inequality means that the people who are better off have gained more of the share of that prosperity, and it hasn't improved the bottom, what I'm talking about, the extreme poor. And there is more optimism, I think, amongst economists for what might happen in South Asia, because South Asia has actually made quite a lot of progress in terms of poverty, not as much as China, but in terms of the remaining poor in South Asia. If India, if Pakistan, if Bangladesh continue on the current growth path, then they are projected to make substantial inroads into poverty. But to achieve what we're actually talking about, which is to end global poverty, it comes down to sub-Saharan Africa. And the issues surrounding that, of course, are complicated. There's no one model, which is what I'm going to go through in a moment. And some of the obvious issues have to be resolved. So the biggest correlation between growth and a factor is no conflict. If there's no conflict, then that is a good predictor of economic prosperity. Multi-party democracy, that's another predictor. But even taking conflict regions aside, if Africa can make progress in the other countries, then that, I think, would take us a long ways down this road of realizing I think, what should be everybody's aim, which is to see no one living on less than $2 per day. So how can we do that? I think we have to think about new ways to grow an economy. So the goal, of course, is to end poverty. And as I say, this goal is made harder because the most successful country that has done it has essentially done it via economic growth. And a lot of that economic growth is via government, as well as allowing businesses to expand. So China's growth has focused a great deal on generating a private sector that exists alongside the state-owned sector, so there's stability, as well as a heavy hand of government in some instances to make sure that the sectors which are promoted, manufacturing, higher-end manufacturing, and then services are the ones that lead the economy in terms of growth. But that growth model, which doesn't focus a lot on redistribution, for instance, which is one of the standard mechanisms of reducing inequality and reducing poverty, isn't a big part of what China or East Asia have done. The share of government in those countries, in that region, is only about 21%. That is less than half of what it is in Western Europe. And so what you have is a model which is probably fairly specific to how those economies have grown. Of course, there are differences in that region, I should stress. East Asia has grown equitably. There's no reason why an economy should grow and have high levels of inequality. Korea, Japan focused a great deal on redistribution. But also, importantly, they focused on what's called pre-distribution. So instead of redistributing, so giving income to the poor by, say, progressive taxation, higher taxes of the rich, what they did was to do pre-distribution, investing so that you have a more equal endowment of education, of human capital, in some instances, land, productive resources. And pre-distribution policies, arguably, is something that can be done by governments as they plan in terms of how they want their economies to grow. Now, a lot of what I'm discussing, of course, is expensive. It's not just a question, as I say, in East Asia, the size of the government is actually fairly small. And that's why the private sector has always played a very big role. And if you look across the development economics literature as a whole, involving the private sector is important because enterprises are the engines of growth and employment creation. So when you look at the role of business, the things that these countries need in order to grow, especially in Africa, a lot of it centers around the three factors of growth: capital, labor, and technology. So capital accumulation, investment, especially by the private sector, is important, as well as what I just discussed as human capital, education, and all of that could boost technology, that could raise the growth rate. So it's not the case that investment hasn't gone into these countries. It's the case that they've gone in, but they haven't been effectively deployed. And I think that's where a new way of thinking about growth in terms of the civil society, in other words, all of us, being able to feed back through civil society organizations, through a knowledge of the local community, to be able to engage with businesses and governments to argue for where funds should be better deployed, for instance, where the need is greatest, maybe would be a way of trying to bridge this gap between what economics tells us can work in terms of growth and then the reality of it not filtering through to local communities where the growth, the entrepreneurs come from. And I think that's one way of thinking about new ways of deploying economic theories and models in a way hopefully that's understandable but also able to achieve something which I hope we can see in my lifetime, which is the end of poverty. Thank you very much.